I stood at the edge of my own home, a glass of scotch in hand, watching as laughter and champagne filled the air. The Sterling estate had never looked grander: golden chandeliers, polished marble floors, and the city's most powerful gathered to celebrate my son's engagement. And yet, I felt nothing. This was supposed to be a proud moment, a testament to the empire I built. But something gnawed at me, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind that refused to be silenced. "Dad," Eleanor's voice pulled me from my thoughts. I turned to find my daughter watching me, one brow arched in that way she always did when she saw through my carefully constructed mask. Dressed in emerald green, she looked every bit as sharp as her mind. "You're brooding," she said, tilting her glass. "That's never a good sign." I let out a short breath, giving her the closest thing to a smile I could muster. "Just keeping an eye on things." Her gaze flickered toward the crowd, and for a moment, I caught something in her expression: hesitation, concern. "If you're waiting for something to go wrong," she murmured, "you might not have to wait long." Before I could ask what she meant, my wife's presence sliced through the air like a cold wind. Catherine Sterling had mastered the art of effortless control. She moved through the crowd like a queen, her sapphire gown hugging her frame, her smile a perfect performance. There was a time when that smile made my chest tighten in the best way. That time had passed. "The Caldwells just arrived," she said, her tone smooth as ever. "Vincent says he has some documents that need your attention, but I told him tonight isn't the time." Vincent Caldwell, my lawyer, my closest friend, a man I had trusted with everything. So why did it feel like my blood had turned to ice at the mention of his name? I set my glass down, forcing my voice to remain steady. "I'll handle it." Catherine smiled, something unreadable flickering behind her eyes. "Of course you will." She turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving me with an unsettling feeling I couldn't shake. I found Vincent waiting for me in the entrance hall, his usual warmth stretched a little too thin. "Alexander," he greeted, shaking my hand as if we hadn't known each other for 20 years. "I trust you've had time to review the documents?" I watched him carefully. "Not yet." "Something urgent?" "Just some minor property transfers." His tone was easy, too easy. "Routine paperwork." I figured it'd be quicker to handle it now. Routine. That word again. "Bring them to my study," I said. "I'll look them over there." He hesitated, barely a fraction of a second, but I saw it. Something was wrong. The moment the door to my study shut, I felt the shift. The warm facade of the party was gone, replaced by the quiet crackle of the fireplace and the weight of something I wasn't ready to face. Vincent set the documents on my desk, casual, unbothered. "Standard transfers," he said, tapping the top page. "Mostly shifting assets between subsidiaries. Just sign here." I took the papers, flipping through them as my pulse quickened. The wording was vague, the structuring too deliberate. I had seen enough contracts in my life to recognize when someone was hiding something in the fine print. And then I saw it. The ownership shifts. The reallocation of assets. The slow, meticulous siphoning of my company. The shell corporations didn't mean much at first. But then, the names hit me. Elora Holdings. KVC Enterprises. Catherine Victoria Caldwell. My wife's maiden name. The room suddenly felt smaller. I lifted my gaze to Vincent, my chest tightening in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the slow, crushing weight of betrayal. "How long?" My voice was quiet. Too quiet. Vincent blinked, feigning confusion. "I'm not sure I understand." "How long have you and Catherine been planning this?" For the first time, his mask slipped. It was just a flicker, a hesitation, a twitch at the corner of his mouth, but I saw it. "You're being paranoid, Alex," he said, too easily. "These are just standard legal adjustments." I set the papers down, my fingers pressing into the desk as I exhaled slowly. I had spent years believing that power protected me, that loyalty was something earned and kept. I had been a fool. I straightened, forcing my expression into something unreadable. "I'll need time to review these." Vincent studied me, his eyes searching mine, and for the first time in 2 decades, I realized I didn't know the man standing in front of me. "Of course," he said finally, Stepping back, the door opened before I could respond, and Lucas, my youngest, entered. His tie slightly loosened, his expression flustered. "Dad, Mom's looking for you." He paused, eyes flicking between me and Vincent. He felt the tension. I forced a smile. "Tell her I'll be right there." Lucas hesitated, but nodded and left. Vincent lingered, adjusting his cufflinks, his voice quieter now. "You've made a grave mistake, my old friend." I met his gaze, something cold and certain settling inside me. "No, Vincent." I exhaled slowly. "You have." A slow smirk ghosted across his lips. "We'll see about that." He left without another word. I turned back to my desk, staring at the papers that had nearly cost me my empire. Outside, the party carried on, the laughter and music hiding the war that had just begun. I barely heard the distant hum of conversation from the party outside my study. The weight of the documents in my hands was heavier than it should have been, as if they carried not just ink and paper, but years of misplaced trust, love, and belief in the people closest to me. Catherine, Vincent, the two people I had always counted on, and they had been conspiring against me in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to rip everything away. My chest felt tight, a dull ache settling somewhere deep beneath my ribs. I should have been furious. Rage should have overtaken me, shaking my bones, blurring my vision. Instead, all I felt was an unnatural stillness, like the eerie calm before a storm that tears through everything in its path. Anger would have been easier, but this was worse. This was heartbreak wrapped in betrayal. I sat down slowly, placing the papers on my desk with careful precision. If I let my fingers tighten around them, I might tear them apart in frustration. A part of me, a small and foolish part, wanted this to be a mistake, a misunderstanding that could be explained away. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I had felt it in the way Catherine smiled at me lately, in the way Vincent had started speaking to me with just a little too much confidence, a little too much certainty. I reached for my phone with a measured breath, dialing the one person who could confirm what I already knew. Alexander. Celeste's voice was clear, businesslike as always. "I need you to look into something for me." My own voice sounded unfamiliar, like I was speaking from a distance, detached from the weight of my own words. She paused. "How deep is the hole?" I exhaled through my nose. "I don't know yet, but I need every financial move Catherine and Vincent have made in the last 5 years traced, analyzed, and mapped. If they so much as shifted a penny, I want to know where it went." There was silence on the other end, then a small hum. "Give me 48 hours. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. "I'll wait." After I ended the call, I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. My study, once my refuge, felt foreign now. The bookshelves, the polished mahogany desk, the familiar smell of aged leather and bourbon. It all felt like remnants of a world that no longer existed. I stood up and made my way back to the party, forcing my face into something that resembled ease. I wasn't ready to confront them yet. If they knew I had figured it out, they would cover their tracks, lock their secrets away before I could expose them. No, I had to let them believe I was still the oblivious fool. Catherine spotted me as I entered the ballroom, her lips curving into a practiced smile as she reached for my arm. I let her take it, let her fingers press lightly against my wrist in that affectionate way she had always done. But now, it felt wrong. Forced. "Darling, I was beginning to wonder if Vincent had locked you in that study of yours," she teased, her voice warm and familiar. I smiled back, but it felt hollow. "He always thinks business comes before everything." I told him I'd review it later. She relaxed slightly against me, and I knew I had said exactly what she wanted to hear. "I hope he wasn't pushing too hard," she murmured, tilting her head up at me with a look of concern so convincing. I might have believed it yesterday. "You've been working so much lately. I don't want you to exhaust yourself." My jaw tightened. The woman who was actively dismantling my empire, stealing what I had spent my life building, was standing here, pretending to care about my well-being. I wanted to ask her why. I wanted to look her in the eyes and demand to know if she had ever truly loved me, or if I had just been a means to an end. Instead, I let out a quiet chuckle. "Nothing I can't handle." Sebastian appeared beside us, looking every bit like the reluctant heir. He adjusted his cuffs, glancing between us before clearing his throat. Dad, a few of the investors wanted to say hello. They were asking about the international expansion deal. I nodded. Of course. Let's go. Catherine's fingers lingered on my wrist for a moment longer before she let go. Don't be too long, she said softly. We have a lot to celebrate tonight. I met her gaze, searching for something. Hesitation, regret, a flicker of guilt. I found nothing but quiet certainty. Not for long. By the time the last guest left, the house was quiet again. Catherine had gone upstairs, Vincent had disappeared into the night, and my children had scattered into their own worlds. But I wasn't ready to sleep. I walked to my private office, locking the door behind me. My hands moved on instinct, entering the passcode to access my personal security server. 3 years ago, after a series of corporate espionage attempts, I had installed a closed surveillance system across the estate. Catherine had called it paranoia. I called it insurance. Footage from the past week played in front of me. At first, nothing. Routine movements, familiar faces. But then there it was. Vincent, arriving at my house well past midnight. Catherine meeting him in my study. The way her hand lingered on his wrist, the way they spoke in hushed voices. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. This wasn't just business. I exhaled slowly, my chest tightening in a way I hadn't expected. I should have been done feeling anything by now, but seeing it with my own eyes made it real in a way that conversations and paperwork never could. I scrubbed through the footage again, watching closely. Then something else caught my eye, a document, Vincent holding up a folder, pointing to something inside. I zoomed in. It was a contract. I took a screenshot, transferring it to my secure drive. I would send it to Celeste first thing in the morning. She would find out exactly what it was. I shut down the feed and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. My mind was already planning the next steps, playing out every possible scenario. They thought they had already won. They had no idea what was coming. The next morning, Celeste called. "You're going to want to see this," she said, and there was something in her voice that made my blood run cold. I met her at a private office downtown. When I walked in, she was already at the table, files spread out in front of her. She didn't waste time. "It's worse than you think." I took a seat. "How bad?" She slid a document toward me. They weren't just moving assets. They were preparing to legally strip you of control over Sterling Enterprises entirely. Vincent has been using clauses buried in old contracts to consolidate voting power. If you had signed those papers last night, you would have handed him full control. I stared at the document, my pulse steady. It wasn't shock anymore. It was calculation. Celeste watched me carefully. "You don't look surprised." "Because I'm not," I murmured. "I just needed confirmation." She leaned forward. "So what's next?" I looked at the files spread out before me, at the sheer arrogance of their betrayal. "We let them think they're winning," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "And then, we bury them." I walked out of the private office with Celeste's findings burning in my hands. The evidence was damning, far worse than I had expected. Catherine and Vincent had been playing the long game, laying traps in contracts I had trusted too blindly. If I had signed those papers, I would have been a powerless figurehead in my own empire, watching as they gutted everything I had built. I drove back to the estate, gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary. The house loomed in the distance, grand as ever, but now it felt different. Not a home, a battlefield. And the war had officially begun. As I stepped inside, the silence was thick, the air still carrying the echoes of last night's celebration. I took the stairs 2 at a time and made my way to my study. Locking the door behind me, I called Celeste again. "I need every one of those documents copied and stored in multiple locations. We're going to use them, but not yet." "Understood," she said. "And Alexander, be careful. They don't know you're onto them yet. But when they do, things will get ugly." I already knew that. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control. And people like Vincent and Catherine, they wouldn't just walk away when the plan fell apart. After the call, I sat in the dim glow of my desk lamp, flipping through the papers once more. My mind was calculating every possible move, every contingency. Then, a knock at the door. I closed the files, smoothing my expression before calling out, "Come in." Eleanor stepped inside, shutting the door softly behind her. She glanced at me, then at my desk, her sharp gaze taking in every detail. "I know something's wrong," she said without preamble. "You've been different since the party." Eleanor had always been the most perceptive of my children. She saw things others didn't, read between the lines. "What makes you say that?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She crossed her arms. "You're careful with your emotions, Dad, but I see it. You're planning something." For a moment, I debated telling her, but I had learned to be cautious, even with family. Still, Eleanor had always been more like me than her siblings. Sharp, relentless. Maybe it was time to test her loyalty. "I need you to trust me," I said finally. "There are things happening that I can't explain just yet, but I will soon." Her eyes flickered with curiosity, frustration even, but she nodded. "If you need me, I'm here." As she left, I leaned back in my chair, exhaling. She had given me her trust. Now I had to decide whether to use it. The next morning, I set the first part of my plan into motion. It started small, calls to key executives, a subtle shift in financial oversight. I had spent decades learning how to build an empire, and now I would use every lesson to protect it. Then, I made my next move. A lunch meeting with Vincent. We met at a private club in the city, one he often used for his more exclusive dealings. He greeted me with his usual charm, but I saw the flicker of calculation in his eyes. "Alexander," he said smoothly, gesturing for me to sit, "you've been hard to pin down lately. Busy with all the expansion plans?" I smiled, setting my glass down. "Something like that." He leaned in slightly. "I hope you had time to look over those documents. I'd like to finalize everything soon." I studied him for a moment, letting silence stretch between us just long enough to make him slightly uncomfortable. Then, I nodded. "I trust you, Vincent, but these are big moves. I need a little more time to go through everything." His expression barely shifted, but I saw the tightness in his jaw. He hadn't expected me to hesitate. They needed this to happen quickly. "Of course," he said easily. "Take all the time you need." Liar. I raised my glass in a casual toast. "To the future." He clinked his glass against mine, but the moment felt hollow. We were both playing a game now, and I had just made my first move. By the time I returned to the estate, I knew one thing for certain. Vincent and Catherine weren't going to wait much longer. And that meant I had to be ready before they made their next move. This was just the beginning. The lie between us was getting thinner. It was stretched so tight that I could hear it straining under the weight of our performances. Catherine was good, better than I had given her credit for, but even she wasn't perfect. The way she moved around me now, softer, more careful, told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't sure if I had figured it out yet. That meant I still had the upper hand. The worst part was, there was a time when I would have leaned into that softness, let myself believe that she still cared. But love makes you blind, and I refused to be blind anymore. That night, as I sat in my study reviewing Celeste's latest findings, I heard her footsteps before I saw her. They weren't hurried, weren't hesitant, just deliberate. She pushed the door open without knocking and walked in like she always had, like she belonged there. Maybe she still thought she did. She came to stand behind me, her hands resting on my shoulders. "You've been distant," she murmured, her voice light, almost playful. I forced a chuckle, keeping my eyes on the papers in front of me. A lot on my mind. Her fingers pressed against the tight muscles in my neck. It used to be a comfort, something intimate. Now, it felt like a test. She was waiting for my body to relax under her touch, waiting to see if I was still the fool she had always assumed me to be. "You work too much," she whispered. "You should take a break. Let Vincent handle some of it. That's what he's here for, isn't it?" There it was. The push. She wasn't even being subtle anymore. I turned slightly, looking up at her. "I trust Vincent," I said carefully, shaping the words into exactly what she wanted to hear. "But you know me. I like to be thorough." Something flickered in her eyes. Something close to frustration, but not quite. Her hands didn't move from my shoulders. Just don't overthink things, Alex. You've always been a man of action. I smiled. You're right. I should move forward soon. She leaned in and kissed my temple, her lips warm, familiar. If I let myself, I could have believed it was real. But I didn't let myself. Not anymore. She left the room, and I exhaled slowly, staring at the closed door. I used to know this woman. I used to wake up beside her every morning and think I had won the greatest prize of my life. She wasn't just my wife. She was my closest friend, the one who saw me when no one else did. And now she was a stranger. Or maybe, just maybe, I had never really known her at all. The next morning, Vincent called. Alexander, he said, his voice smooth, casual. I was wondering if we could meet again. There are just a few final details I'd like to discuss before we move forward. I recognized the urgency beneath the charm. They were pushing now, testing me, trying to keep me in line. I let out a soft breath, making it sound like I was considering. Let's meet tomorrow, I said. I have a few things I need to finalize today. There was a pause, brief but telling. Then Vincent chuckled. Of course. Tomorrow, then. I hung up and immediately called Celeste. They're getting impatient, I said. I need to know if we have enough. She sighed on the other end of the line. We had enough days ago, Alexander. We have more than enough to bury them. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The power to end this was in my hands. So why did I feel like I was losing something? For all their deception, there had been years before this. Years where I trusted them. Years where we built something together. Catherine wasn't just my wife. She was the mother of my children. Vincent wasn't just my lawyer. He was my best friend. It should have made me hesitate. It didn't. They had made their choice. And tomorrow, I would make mine. I spent the night alone in my study, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the inevitable pressing against my ribs. Tomorrow, I would rip the mask off and let them see what they had done. There was no stopping it now. The plan was already in motion. But it didn't feel like victory. I poured myself a drink, but it tasted like nothing. The whiskey that used to warm my chest now felt like acid. I wasn't even sure what I was mourning. The loss of my wife, the loss of my best friend, or the loss of the man I used to be before all of this. At some point, I must have drifted into a shallow sleep, because when I opened my eyes, the study was dimly lit by the first morning light. My phone buzzed on the desk. Celeste. It's done, she said when I answered. Everything is prepared. Are you ready? I swallowed, my throat dry. More than ever. I arrived at the club early, needing the moment of silence before the storm. Vincent chose this place for our meeting. A high-end private lounge where business was always discussed in hushed voices, where people with power made decisions that changed lives. He walked in 10 minutes late, as if to remind me who held the control. He didn't. Alexander, he greeted with a familiar smile. The same damn smile that had fooled me for years. Hope I didn't keep you waiting. I motioned for him to sit. Not at all. He flagged the waiter, ordered his usual whiskey, then turned back to me with that confident ease. I assume we're here to finalize everything? I studied him, wondering how long he had been waiting for this moment. How many nights he had sat with Catherine, planning, adjusting, making sure every detail was in place. You've been with me for 20 years, I said instead. Vincent blinked. Of course. I trusted you, I continued, voice steady. With my company. With my family. His fingers tightened around the glass. Alexander, what are you? Save it. I set the documents on the table between us. The very same ones he had tried to slip under my nose. The ones that would have handed him my empire. His face didn't change, but I saw it. The slight shift in his posture, the way his eyes flickered toward the papers. He knew. I leaned in. How long, Vincent? He exhaled slowly, setting his glass down. Does it matter? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. It matters to me. Vincent was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he met my gaze. 5 years. I felt something in my chest tighten. 5 years. That meant Catherine had been lying to me for half a decade, had been planning this long before I ever suspected. Was it always about the money? I asked, my voice quieter now. His jaw clenched. It was about power, Alex. You hoard it like it's oxygen. You act like you built this all alone. I let his words settle, watching him. I had expected excuses. I hadn't expected honesty. I leaned back, tilting my head slightly. And Catherine? Vincent hesitated, then sighed. It started as a game, but after a while, I think she started believing in it more than I did. I nodded, as if that was something I could understand. Maybe in a way, I did. I reached into my jacket pocket and slid another folder across the table. This is for you. Vincent frowned, flipping it open. His face drained of color as he skimmed the pages. Evidence, bank records, phone transcripts. Enough to ensure that when this was over, he wouldn't just lose the company. He'd lose everything. His hands trembled slightly as he closed the folder. You're going to ruin me, he murmured. I studied him for a long moment. No, Vincent. You ruined yourself. The waiter arrived with his drink, oblivious to the war happening at this table. Vincent didn't touch it. You have until tonight, I said, standing. Resign. Quietly. Or this goes public. Vincent said nothing as I walked away. By the time I got back to the estate, my hands were steady, my heart calm. The first enemy had fallen. Now, it was time for the second. The house was too quiet when I returned. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. It was the kind that pressed against my chest, making it harder to breathe. The kind that told me everything was about to change. Catherine was in the lounge, a glass of wine in her hand. One leg crossed over the other, watching the fire crackle in the grand stone fireplace. She looked completely at ease, as if she hadn't spent the last 5 years planning to rip my life apart. She turned her head when she heard my footsteps. You're late, she said lightly. I poured myself a drink, letting the burn of whiskey settle in my throat before answering. Vincent resigned today. Her hand tightened slightly around the stem of her wine glass, but she didn't flinch. Did he? I nodded, watching her carefully. Said he wanted to focus on his personal affairs. She tilted her head slightly, studying me the way one might study an opponent in a chess match. And you believe that? No. The air shifted between us. The last remnants of the illusion we had both been holding on to finally cracked. I saw it in the way her shoulders tensed, the way she exhaled just a little too slowly. She knew. She knew I had finally figured it out. I set my glass down, my fingers tracing the edge of the table as I forced myself to say the words out loud. How long were you going to wait? There was no pretending now. No laughter, no soft reassurances. She didn't ask what I meant, didn't feign innocence. Instead, she took a sip of her wine, placed the glass down gently, and finally met my gaze. We hadn't decided yet, she admitted. I let out a short, humorless laugh. We. She sighed, rubbing her temple. Do you want me to lie, Alex? Because I can. I can sit here and spin some story about how it wasn't what you think, about how I never meant for it to go this far. But we both know that's not true. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. 5 years. The words felt heavy on my tongue. That's how long you and Vincent have been planning this. How long you've been waiting for the right moment to take everything. She didn't deny it. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, searching her face for something. Remorse, hesitation, regret. Tell me something, Catherine. Was there ever a moment where you felt guilty, even for a second? She looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw something honest in her eyes. But it wasn't guilt. No, it shouldn't have surprised me. But it did. It hit me like a gut punch, knocking the air from my lungs. I had known the truth, had seen the evidence with my own eyes, but hearing her say it, hearing the finality in her voice, felt different. I swallowed against the ache in my chest. Why? She exhaled slowly, as if she had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the chance to finally say the things she had been holding back for years. Because I got tired of waiting, Alex. Of standing next to you while you built an empire and pretending it was ours. It was never ours. It was always yours. And you were never going to let that change. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle. She wasn't wrong. Maybe that was the worst part. I had spent so much time focused on building something unbreakable that I had never considered whether she felt like a part of it. You could have left, I said quietly. You could have taken what was yours and walked away. She let out a dry, bitter laugh. And what? Start over? No, Alex. That's not how this works. I shook my head. You played Vincent, didn't you? She gave me a small, tired smile. He thought we were in this together. He thought we'd run things side by side. But you and I both know, Vincent was never the type to lead. A part of me wanted to feel sorry for him, but I couldn't. He had chosen this, just like she had. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a folder, identical to the one I had given Vincent. I placed it on the table between us. Her eyes flickered toward it, but she didn't touch it. You have two choices, I said. You leave quietly. Sign the divorce papers. Take the settlement I'm offering. Or, I gestured to the folder. Everything in here goes public. And believe me, Catherine, you won't like what happens when it does. She stared at the folder for a long time. Then, she finally spoke. And what about the kids? Her voice wavered, just slightly. I swallowed hard. This part hurt the most. That depends on you. If you want to keep any part of this family intact, you'll take what I'm offering and walk away. For the first time, I saw something break in her expression. Just for a second, she reached for the folder, flipping it open. As her eyes moved over the documents, bank records, fraudulent transactions, emails, and messages, I saw her throat tighten. She knew. This wasn't just a fight anymore. She had lost. When she looked up at me, her eyes were unreadable. You really think you've won, don't you? I met her gaze. I know I have. She closed the folder, exhaling slowly. Fine. Not a plea, not an apology. Just resignation. I turned to leave, but her voice stopped me at the door. I loved you once, Alex. I didn't turn around. I know. Then I walked out, leaving her with the wreckage of what she had tried to steal. By the next morning, Catherine's lawyers had contacted mine. She was taking the deal. The divorce would be swift, the settlement generous enough for her to disappear quietly. Vincent was already gone. And me? I stood at the top of my empire, looking down at the city I had fought so hard to build, knowing that for the first time in years, I was truly standing alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what I needed.